The dust billowed across the horizon as Amelia Foster clutched the worn letter in her trembling hands, the promise she'd made 3 years ago weighing on her heart like lead. The year was 1876, and the unforgiving Montana Territory had changed her in ways she never imagined possible. She stood at the edge of Sweet Creek, her decision made, though it tore her apart to even think the words she'd have to say to him. Xavier Reed dismounted his horse with practiced ease, his eyes squinting against the setting sun as he approached the small homestead. 3 years of wandering, of driving cattle across state lines and dodging bullets from rustlers, had hardened him, but not his heart. Never his heart. That belonged to the woman who'd asked him to give her time, the woman whose father had forbidden their courtship, the woman he'd promised to return to. "Miss Amelia," he called, removing his hat as she turned to face him. Her honey blonde hair was pulled back in a simple braid, her blue eyes wide with surprise. She looked thinner than he remembered, with new lines etched around her eyes that spoke of hardship. "Xavier," she breathed, quickly tucking the letter into her apron pocket. "You came back. I said I would." His smile faltered when she didn't return it. 3 years to the day, just like I promised. Amelia swallowed hard, forcing herself to stand straighter. "A lot has changed, Xavier. Not everything," he said, taking a step toward her. "Not how I feel." She shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. "Don't wait for me anymore, Xavier. Please, you need to move on with your life." Xavier stood still, his hat clutched in his hands, dirt from the trail still clinging to his clothes. "Waiting is all I know, Amelia. It's all I've done these past 3 years." Amelia turned away, unable to bear the look of confusion and hurt on his face. She couldn't tell him about her father's debts, about the arrangement that would save their ranch, about Albert Thornfield's proposal and her reluctant acceptance. How could she explain that in 2 weeks' time she would be married to a man she didn't love? "Father's inside," she said, her voice barely audible. "He'll want to know you're here." Xavier reached out, his calloused fingers gently catching her arm. "Amelia, what's happened?" "What aren't you telling me?" Before she could answer, the sound of approaching hoofbeats drew their attention. A sleek black carriage pulled by 2 matching thoroughbreds rolled up the dusty path to the Foster homestead. Amelia's face went pale. "Who's that?" Xavier asked, his hand instinctively moving to rest on his holstered revolver. "Albert Thornfield," she whispered. My fiancé." Xavier's hand dropped to his side as though burned. "Fiancé," he repeated, the word tasting like poison on his tongue. The carriage door opened, and out stepped a well-dressed man in his 40s, his silver-streaked hair slicked back beneath an expensive hat. He surveyed the property with the calculating gaze of someone assessing an investment. "Amelia, my dear," Albert called, his voice carrying the polish of Eastern schooling. "I've brought the papers for your father to sign." Xavier looked between them, understanding dawning on his weathered face. "This is why you said not to wait." Amelia nodded, a single tear escaping down her cheek. "I'm sorry, Xavier, I truly am." Albert approached, extending his hand to Xavier with the confidence of a man who had never known true hardship. "And who might this be, my dear?" "Xavier Reed," he answered before Amelia could speak, his voice level despite the storm raging inside him. "An old friend of the family." "Ah, splendid," Albert said, his smile not reaching his eyes. "Any friend of the Fosters is a friend of mine. After all, we'll all be one big family soon enough." Xavier nodded curtly, jamming his hat back onto his head. "Congratulations on your engagement," he said, the words hollow and forced. "If you'll excuse me, I have business in town." "Xavier, wait," Amelia called after him as he strode back to his horse. He paused, turning slightly but not fully facing her. "You said don't wait for you," he said quietly, so only she could hear. "But waiting is all I know, Amelia, and I reckon I'll keep doing it until I draw my last breath." With that, he mounted his horse and rode away, leaving a cloud of dust and Amelia's breaking heart in his wake. George Foster watched from the window of the small ranch house, his rheumy eyes following Xavier's retreating figure. At 62, illness had ravaged his once powerful frame, leaving him gaunt and weak. When Amelia entered the house, her eyes red-rimmed, he sighed heavily. He came back, George stated, his voice raspy. Yes, Amelia replied, busying herself with the kettle, just like he promised. And you sent him away, just like I made you promise. Amelia's hands stilled. I did what was necessary for the ranch, Father, for you. George Foster had once been the proudest rancher in Sweet Creek. Now, with mounting debts and failing health, he had agreed to Albert Thornfield's proposal the man would pay off their debts and provide medical care for George in exchange for Amelia's hand in marriage and the eventual ownership of the Foster land. Albert brought the final contracts, Amelia said, setting a cup of tea before her father. He's waiting in the parlor, George nodded, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon where Xavier had disappeared. That boy loved you something fierce. And I loved him, Amelia admitted, her voice breaking. But love doesn't pay debts or buy medicine. No, George agreed sadly. It doesn't. In town, Xavier tied his horse outside the Sweet Creek saloon, his mind reeling from the encounter with Amelia. The establishment was crowded, filled with cowboys, miners, and the occasional traveler passing through. He made his way to the bar, ordering whiskey and downing it in one burning gulp. Xavier Reed, as I live and breathe, came a familiar voice. Thought you'd left these parts for good. Xavier turned to see Sheriff Daniel Miller, an old friend and one of the few honest lawmen in the territory. Just got back today, Xavier replied, signaling for another drink. Daniel slid onto the stool beside him. Guessing you've already been out to the Foster place, Xavier's jaw tightened. News travels fast. Small town, Daniel shrugged. And Thornfield makes sure everyone knows his business, been strutting around town like a peacock, telling anyone who will listen about his upcoming nuptials. What do you know about him? Xavier asked, his voice low. Daniel glanced around before leaning closer. Came from back east about a year ago, bought the old Clayton mine, though it had been tapped out years before, started lending money to folks down on their luck. The sheriff paused. Interest rates that would make a snake oil salesman blush. And George Foster borrowed from him. George was desperate. Ranch was failing, he was sick, and Amelia was working herself to the bone trying to keep things afloat. Xavier cursed under his breath. So Thornfield swoops in, offers to clear the debt in exchange for Amelia and the land. That's about the size of it, Daniel confirmed. Wedding's set for 2 weeks from now. Xavier stood, tossing coins on the counter. I need a room, planning to stay a while. Horizon Hotels got vacancies, Daniel offered. Xavier, he added as the cowboy turned to leave, treading between a man and his fiancée is dangerous business. Xavier's eyes hardened. So is threatening a man who's got nothing left to lose. The following morning, Amelia rode into town alone, a list of wedding preparations clutched in her hand. The thought of marrying Albert made her stomach turn, but she forced herself to focus on the practical benefits. Her father would receive the care he needed, and the ranch, her mother's legacy, would remain in operation, even if it wouldn't truly be hers anymore. As she tied her horse outside the general store, she felt the weight of stares from townsfolk. Some looked at her with pity, others with envy for marrying into apparent wealth. None of them understood the sacrifice she was making. Miss Foster, called Mrs. Peterson, the seamstress, hurrying across the street. Mr. Thornfield has already arranged for your wedding dress. Finest silk from San Francisco, he says. I'll need to take your measurements. Amelia forced a smile. Of course, I can stop by this afternoon. Splendid, Mrs. Peterson beamed. Such a fortunate match. Mr. Thornfield is quite the catch. Yes, Amelia agreed hollowly. Quite, as Mrs. Peterson bustled away. Amelia felt a presence behind her. Turning, she found herself face to face with Xavier, his blue eyes piercing in the morning light. Xavier, she breathed, her heart racing despite her best efforts to remain composed. Morning, Miss Foster, he said formally, though his eyes belied his casual tone. Heard congratulations are in order. Amelia glanced around, aware of the curious gazes of passers-by. Thank you, she replied stiffly. If you'll excuse me, I have errands to run. Xavier stepped aside, but as she moved past him, he spoke quietly. Why didn't you write to me, Amelia? All those years, not a single letter. She paused, not turning to face him. I did write, Every week for the first year, but the trail moves, Xavier, and so do cowboys. I wrote back every chance I got, he insisted. Sent them to your father's ranch. Amelia's brow furrowed in confusion. I never received anything. Before they could continue the conversation, Albert's carriage appeared at the end of the street. Amelia straightened, composing herself. I have to go. Please, Xavier, for both our sakes, don't make this harder than it already is. She hurried into the general store, leaving Xavier standing in the dust, his mind working through what she'd said. If she'd written and he'd written back, where had the letters gone? Inside the store, Amelia was greeted by the proprietor, Samuel Jenkins, a kindly older man who had known her since childhood. Morning, Miss Amelia, he said, his eyes crinkling at the corners. What can I help you with today? I need supplies for the ranch, she replied, handing him her list. And some items for the wedding. Samuel's smile faltered slightly. Of course, I'll gather these for you. As he moved about the store, he added, saw young Reed outside, always thought you two would. He trailed off, realizing his indiscretion. Forgive me, Miss Amelia, not my place. It's all right, Mr. Jenkins, Amelia assured him, though her heart ached. Xavier and I were young, dreams change. Samuel nodded, though his eyes reflected doubt. Mr. Thornfield was in earlier, by the by, said to put anything you need on his account. Amelia's spine stiffened. Already her independence was slipping away. Thank you, but I'll pay for these myself. As Samuel gathered her supplies, the bell above the door jingled and Albert entered, his imposing figure filling the small space. Amelia, my dear, I thought I might find you here. He approached, placing a proprietary hand on her waist. Amelia resisted the urge to step away. I've just come from signing the final agreements with your father, Albert announced. Everything is settled, the ranch is secure, and I've arranged for a specialist from Denver to examine him next week. Relief flooded Amelia, tempered by the knowledge of what this meant for her future. Thank you, Albert, that's wonderful news. I also took the liberty of ordering some new furnishings for the ranch house, he continued. The place could use some updating, don't you think? The ranch house that her mother had lovingly decorated, that held every memory of her childhood. Perhaps, she said noncommittally. Albert's grip on her waist tightened slightly. I saw Reed outside, old sweetheart of yours, I'm told. A friend, Amelia corrected, acutely aware of Samuel's presence nearby. From before you arrived in Sweet Creek. Albert's smile didn't reach his eyes. Well, I'm sure he'll find somewhere else to hang his hat soon enough. Sweet Creek is changing, no place for drifters anymore. Outside, Xavier had made his way to the sheriff's office, his suspicions growing with every moment. Daniel looked up from his desk as Xavier entered. Need to know more about Thornfield, Xavier said without preamble. Something doesn't add up. Daniel sighed, leaning back in his chair. Been wondering that myself. Man shows up out of nowhere, buys a worthless mine, starts lending money, then sets his sights on the Foster ranch despite there being larger, more profitable spreads in the area. The ranch borders the old Clayton mine, doesn't it? Xavier asked, an idea forming. Daniel's eyes widened in understanding. East Boundary runs right up against it. You thinking what I'm thinking? That maybe the mine isn't as worthless as everyone believes, Xavier nodded. Needs looking into. I can ride out there tomorrow, take a look around, Daniel offered. Xavier shook his head. Not official business, might spook him. I'll go tonight after dark. Be careful, Daniel warned. Thornfield's got men working for him, rough types. Xavier's hand rested on his revolver. I can handle myself. As the day wore on, Amelia completed her errands under Albert's watchful eye. Every choice, from the flowers for the wedding to the menu for the reception, was subtly guided by his preferences. By the time they returned to the ranch, Amelia felt suffocated. George was sitting on the porch, a blanket over his legs despite the warm afternoon. His face brightened at the sight of his daughter, though his smile dimmed when Albert helped her down from the carriage. "How are you feeling, Father?" Amelia asked, kissing his cheek. "Better today," George replied, his eyes meeting hers meaningfully. Clear-headed, Albert cleared his throat. "Amelia, I need to return to town. Business matters to attend to. I'll be back for dinner tomorrow." He bent to kiss her cheek, his lips lingering uncomfortably close to hers. Remember what we discussed about your old friend." After Albert departed, Amelia sank onto the porch step beside her father's chair, releasing a long-held breath. "He's controlling," George observed, his voice stronger than it had been in weeks. Amelia couldn't deny it. "It's a small price to pay for your health, father." George reached for her hand. "I've been a selfish old man, Amelia, allowing you to sacrifice your happiness for mine." "It was my choice," she insisted. George shook his head. "No, it wasn't. I pushed you into this because I was afraid of dying, afraid of leaving you with nothing." He paused, gathering strength. "Xavier came by while you were in town." Amelia's head snapped up. "What, why?" "To ask about the letters," George said, shame etched on his weathered face. "The ones you wrote to him, the ones he wrote to you?" A cold feeling settled in Amelia's stomach. "What are you saying, father?" George couldn't meet her eyes. "I kept them from you, all of them, and I never sent yours." Amelia stood, disbelief and betrayal washing over her. "You what?" "For 3 years I thought he'd forgotten me, moved on, and all that time. I thought I was protecting you," George defended weakly. "A cowboy with nothing to his name, always on the move. What kind of life would that be for my daughter? It would have been my choice." Amelia cried, tears streaming down her face. "You had no right." George pulled a small bundle from inside his jacket. "He left these for you, said it was time you had them." With trembling hands, Amelia took the stack of letters tied with twine. Xavier's handwriting covered the envelopes, some yellowed with age, others newer, dozens of them. "I'm sorry, Amelia," George whispered. "So sorry." Amelia clutched the letters to her chest, torn between anger at her father's deception and the sudden, painful bloom of hope in her heart. But the hope withered as quickly as it had come. It was too late. The contracts were signed, the debts paid, the wedding planned. She was bound to Albert Thornfield now, regardless of what Xavier's letters might contain. "I need to be alone," she said, her voice hollow, and retreated into the house. As night fell over Sweet Creek, Xavier made his way to the Clayton mine. The moon was high, providing just enough light to navigate the rocky terrain without a lantern. He tied his horse a good distance away and approached on foot, keeping to the shadows. The mine entrance was boarded up, with a sign declaring it closed and dangerous. But Xavier noticed fresh bootprints in the dirt and signs that the boards had been recently removed and replaced. Someone had been here, and recently. Finding a loose board, Xavier pried it away and slipped inside, lighting a small lantern once he was deep enough that the glow wouldn't be visible from outside. The air was stale but not unbreathable, suggesting some form of ventilation was still working. As he moved deeper into the mine, he noticed that the support beams were new, not the rotting timbers one would expect in an abandoned shaft. Someone had been maintaining this place in secret. The tunnel forked, and Xavier followed the path that showed the most recent signs of use. After several hundred yards, the tunnel opened into a larger chamber. Xavier raised his lantern, and the light reflected back from the walls in a telling glimmer, gold. Not a mere vein, but a rich deposit that had clearly been missed by the original miners. This wasn't just a lucky find, it was a fortune. "Well, well," came a voice from behind him. "Looks like we've got ourselves a trespasser." Xavier whirled around to find 2 men blocking the tunnel, guns drawn. He recognized them as men he'd seen in town, often in Thornfield's company. "Just taking a look around," Xavier said calmly, assessing his options. "Mr. Thornfield don't appreciate curious types," the larger of the 2 men said, stepping forward. "Especially ones sniffing around his fiancée." "Funny thing about that mine deed," Xavier replied, slowly setting down his lantern. "It doesn't include the Foster ranch, yet." The men exchanged glances. "Smart fella," the second man sneered. "Too smart for his own good." Xavier moved faster than either man expected, drawing his revolver and firing in one fluid motion. The shot echoed deafeningly in the confined space, striking the lantern at his feet and plunging the chamber into darkness. In the confusion, Xavier ducked behind a pile of rocks as bullets flew wildly, ricocheting off the stone walls. Taking advantage of his knowledge of the tunnel layout, Xavier moved silently toward the exit, firing occasionally to keep the men pinned down. He reached the fork and sprinted for the entrance, bursting out into the night air just as another shot rang out, tearing through his left arm. Ignoring the burning pain, Xavier ran for his horse, mounted, and galloped away, the sounds of pursuit fading behind him. He had what he needed: confirmation that Thornfield's interest in the Foster ranch had nothing to do with Amelia and everything to do with the gold that lay beneath it. At the Foster ranch, Amelia sat by lamplight, reading Xavier's letters with tears streaming down her face. Each one spoke of his love for her, his hopes for their future, his determination to make something of himself before returning to claim her hand. The most recent, dated just a month ago, told of his success. He had saved enough to buy a small spread in Wyoming territory with good grazing land and a sturdy house. He was coming back for her, just as he'd promised. A soft knock at her bedroom window startled her. Drawing back the curtain, she gasped at the sight of Xavier, his face pale in the moonlight, blood seeping through his sleeve. Without hesitation, she opened the window. "Xavier, what happened?" "Need to talk to you," he said, his voice strained. "Important." Amelia helped him through the window, easing him onto a chair and quickly gathering bandages and water. As she cleaned his wound, a bullet grazed that looked worse than it was. Xavier told her about the mine, the gold, and Thornfield's true motives. "He doesn't want you, Amelia," Xavier concluded. "He wants the land, the gold underneath it. That's why he targeted your father when he was at his most vulnerable." Amelia's hands stilled. "How can we prove this? Sheriff Miller needs to see the mine, the new supports, the gold, but we need to move fast. Thornfield's men saw me." "They'll tell him." Amelia sat back on her heels, her mind racing. "The wedding is in 12 days. Father signed over partial rights to the ranch already, but Thornfield doesn't get full ownership until after we're married." She looked up at Xavier, determination hardening her features. "We need to stop him." Xavier nodded, then reached into his pocket and pulled out a crumpled envelope. "Found this in the mine office. It's a telegram from someone back east. Mentions Thornfield by another named Charles Harrington. Says he's wanted for fraud in Boston." Amelia took the telegram, reading it with growing horror. "We need to show this to Sheriff Miller right away." "At first light," Xavier agreed, "but you should know, I read your letters too, the ones your father kept from me." Amelia's cheeks flushed. "Then you know how I felt. How I still feel despite everything." Xavier's good hand found hers. "I meant what I said yesterday, Amelia. Waiting is all I know, and I'd wait a lifetime for you." The sound of a horse approaching sent them both to the window. A rider was coming fast down the road toward the ranch, one of Thornfield's men. "He's coming to warn your father," Xavier said grimly. "Or worse." Amelia's face paled. "Father's room is downstairs. If they try to hurt him, get your father," Xavier instructed, checking his revolver. "Use the back door. Take him to Sheriff Miller. I'll hold them off." Amelia hesitated, then impulsively leaned forward and pressed her lips to his. "Be careful," she whispered, then hurried from the room. She found her father already awake, alerted by the approaching rider. "Amelia." "What's happening?" Quickly, she explained the situation, helping him dress and gather his medicines. "We need to get to town to Sheriff Miller." George nodded, more alert than he'd been in months. "I knew there was something not right about that man, too smooth by half." They slipped out the back door just as the rider pounded on the front. From the window, Xavier watched as 2 more riders appeared, joining the first, 3 against 1, not the best odds, but he'd faced worse. The men began to circle the house, one heading for the back. Xavier fired a warning shot, sending the man diving for cover. "That's far enough," he called. "Next one won't miss, Reed," one of the men shouted. "Thornfield wants a word with you. Just come out nice and easy." "Tell Thornfield, or should I say Harrington, he can come himself if he's got something to say." The name drop had the desired effect. The men conferred hurriedly, then the leader called back, "This ain't over, Reed." They mounted their horses and rode toward town straight in the direction Amelia and George had gone. Xavier swore, rushing to his horse tied at the back of the house. He had to reach Amelia before Thornfield's men did. The race to town was desperate, with Xavier pushing his horse to its limits. He caught sight of Amelia and George just as they reached the outskirts of Sweet Creek, the 3 riders gaining on them fast. Spurring his mount forward, Xavier intercepted the pursuers. firing his revolver into the air. The shots alerted the town, lights appearing in windows and doors opening as curious residents peered out. "Sheriff," Xavier shouted as he rode down the main street. Sheriff Miller Daniel emerged from his office, gun drawn. Taking in the scene, Xavier bleeding, Amelia and George looking terrified, 3 armed men in pursuit, he raised his weapon. "That's far enough, boys," he called to Thornfield's men. "Drop those guns unless you want to see the inside of my jail." The standoff might have ended there if not for the arrival of Albert Thornfield himself, riding in from the direction of the mine with 4 more armed men. "What is the meaning of this?" he demanded, his cultured voice at odds with the fury in his eyes. "Sheriff, I demand you arrest this man for trespassing and theft." Xavier dismounted, helping Amelia and George down from their horse. "The only thief here is you, Thornfield, or should I call you Harrington?" Thornfield's face paled momentarily before he regained his composure. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Charles Harrington," Sheriff Miller said, recognition dawning on his face. "Wanted in Boston for swindling investors in a non-existent railroad scheme. There's a poster with your face on it in my office." A crowd had gathered now, the entire town of Sweet Creek watching as the drama unfolded. Thornfield's men looked uncertain, glancing at their employer for direction. "This is absurd," Thornfield blustered. "I am a legitimate businessman." "These accusations are nothing but the jealous ravings of a lovesick cowboy." "Then you won't mind if we take a look at that mine of yours," Daniel suggested. "The one that's supposedly played out but has new support beams and fresh dig marks." Thornfield's expression hardened. "This ends now," he said, reaching inside his coat. Xavier moved faster, tackling Amelia and George to the ground as Thornfield drew a small derringer. The shot went wild and chaos erupted. Townspeople scattered for cover as Thornfield's men drew their weapons. Sheriff Miller fired, hitting one of the men in the shoulder. 2 more deputies emerged from the jail, adding their guns to the fight. In moments, it was clear that Thornfield was outnumbered, his men outgunned by the law and the armed citizens of Sweet Creek. "It's over, Thornfield," Daniel called. "Drop the gun." For a moment, it seemed Thornfield would surrender. Then, with a curse, he wheeled his horse and spurred it toward the edge of town. Xavier was on his feet in an instant, mounting his own horse and giving chase. The pursuit led out of town and toward the mine, with Thornfield maintaining his lead despite Xavier's best efforts. As they neared the mine entrance, Thornfield veered suddenly down a narrow ravine. Xavier followed, only to find himself in a dead end, Thornfield nowhere in sight. Cautiously, Xavier dismounted, drawing his gun and scanning the rocky walls. A noise above made him look up just as Thornfield leaped from a ledge, knocking him to the ground. The 2 men grappled in the dust, Thornfield's refined appearance giving way to desperate savagery. "She was never meant for you," Thornfield spat, landing a blow to Xavier's wounded arm that made him cry out in pain. "A filthy cowboy with nothing to offer her." Xavier's response was a powerful uppercut that sent Thornfield reeling backward. "I offered her the only thing that matters," Xavier growled. "Love, something you wouldn't understand." Thornfield laughed, a cold, hollow sound. Love doesn't build empires, boy, gold does, and I was so close." His hand moved to his boot, drawing a hidden knife. The blade flashed in the moonlight as Thornfield lunged. Xavier sidestepped, but not quickly enough to avoid a slash across his ribs. He staggered, then drove his shoulder into Thornfield's midsection, sending them both crashing into the ravine wall. The impact loosened rocks above them, and a small cascade of stones clattered down. One struck Thornfield on the temple, dazing him momentarily. Xavier seized the advantage, wrestling the knife away and pinning the older man to the ground. "It's over," Xavier panted, blood seeping through his shirt. "The sheriff knows everything, the fraud, the gold, all of it." Thornfield's face contorted with rage. "You think this ends here? Men like me don't lose, Reed." "I have connections, money, not anymore," came Amelia's voice from the entrance to the ravine. She stood with Sheriff Miller and several deputies, all armed. "Your scheme is exposed, Mr. Thornfield, or Mr. Harrington, whatever your name really is." As the deputies moved in to arrest Thornfield, Amelia rushed to Xavier's side, her hands gentle as she examined his new wound. "You're hurt again," she said, her voice breaking. "Worth it," Xavier replied with a weak smile. "Though I'm starting to think you're bad luck for my health, Miss Foster." Amelia laughed through her tears. "Then perhaps I should stay close to make sure you don't get into any more trouble." The aftermath unfolded rapidly. Thornfield and his men were jailed, awaiting transport to face charges in both Montana Territory and back east. The gold mine was properly registered, with the Sweet Creek Bank overseeing operations until ownership could be legally determined. As for the Foster Ranch, the contracts Thornfield had forced George to sign were declared null and void, the product of fraud and coercion. The debt remained, but with a legitimate stake in the mine's profits, the Fosters would have no trouble paying it off. 2 weeks later, on what would have been Amelia's wedding day, she instead found herself on the porch of the ranch house, watching Xavier split firewood despite Doc Sullivan's orders to rest his healing wounds. "You're the most stubborn man I've ever met, Xavier Reed," she called, setting down a glass of lemonade on the railing. Xavier grinned, setting aside the axe and approaching the porch. "Had a good teacher," he replied, nodding toward the house where George was resting comfortably, his health improving daily now that the stress of impending financial ruin had lifted. Amelia handed him the lemonade, their fingers brushing. Neither pulled away, instead letting the touch linger. "I read all your letters," she said softly. "Every last one. And I yours," Xavier replied. "Your father gave them to me yesterday, said it was past time I knew what was in them." Amelia's face grew serious. "I meant every word, Xavier. Even when I thought you'd forgotten me, I never stopped loving you." Xavier set down the glass and took her hands in his. "Then you should know I meant every word too, especially about that place in Wyoming." "Wyoming," Amelia repeated, a small smile playing at her lips. "Good grazing land. Clear streams, a house that needs a woman's touch but solid, room for horses, cattle, children someday." Xavier's eyes held her steadily. "It's still there waiting, like I was waiting for you." Amelia stepped closer, her heart pounding. "When you rode away that first day when I told you not to wait for me, I never thought. That waiting is all I know," Xavier finished for her. "I meant it, Amelia. I would have waited forever if that's what it took." "You don't have to wait anymore," she whispered, reaching up to touch his face. "I'm right here." Xavier's arms encircled her waist, drawing her against him. "Then there's just one question left," he said, his voice husky. "Will you come with me to Wyoming, Amelia Foster, as my wife?" Amelia's answer was in her kiss, fierce and certain, sealing a promise that had endured separation, deception, and danger. When they finally broke apart, both breathless, she smiled up at him. "Yes," she said simply. "Yes to Wyoming, yes to being your wife, yes to everything." George Foster watched from the window, a bittersweet smile on his weathered face. He had nearly lost his daughter to his own fear and pride. But now, seeing her in the arms of the man she truly loved, he knew he had been given a second chance to do right by her. Outside, as the sun began to set over the Montana hills, Xavier held Amelia close, his chin resting on top of her head. "No more waiting," he murmured into her hair. Amelia's arms tightened around him. "No more waiting," she agreed, "just living together." The wedding took place a month later in the small church in Sweet Creek. The entire town turned out for the occasion, curious to see the culmination of what had become the most talked-about romance in the territory. Amelia wore a simple white dress made by Mrs. Peterson, with wildflowers in her hair instead of the extravagant veil Thornfield had ordered. George Foster, looking healthier than he had in years, proudly walked his daughter down the aisle to where Xavier waited, clean-shaven and dressed in a new suit, his face alight with joy and anticipation. "Who gives this woman?" the preacher asked. "I do," George replied, his voice steady. Then, in a quieter tone meant only for Xavier, he added, "Take care of her, son." Xavier nodded solemnly. "With my life, sir." As Amelia took her place beside Xavier, the preacher began the ceremony. The words were traditional, but the love that flowed between the bride and groom was anything but ordinary. It was a love tested by time and trial, strengthened by adversity, and ultimately triumphant. When it came time for the vows, Xavier took Amelia's hands in his. I, Xavier Reed, take you, Amelia Foster, to be my wife. I promise to love you, honor you, and protect you all the days of my life. I promise to build a home with you, to create a life worthy of your trust in me. And I promise never to leave you waiting, not ever again. Tears glistened in Amelia's eyes as she responded, I, Amelia Foster, take you, Xavier Reed, to be my husband. I promise to love you, honor you, and stand by your side through whatever life brings us. I promise to make a home with you wherever we may go. And I promise that from this day forward, we'll never have to wait for love again because it's right here between us forever. The preacher smiled. By the power vested in me, I now pronounce you husband and wife. You may kiss your bride. Xavier needed no further invitation. Drawing Amelia into his arms, he kissed her with all the love and promise of their future together. The cheers of the congregation fading to a distant murmur as they lost themselves in that perfect moment. The celebration afterward was filled with music, dancing, and more food than the small town had seen in one place in years. George Foster, seated in a place of honor, watched with contentment as his daughter and new son-in-law moved among their guests, their happiness infectious. Sheriff Daniel Miller raised a glass in toast. To Xavier and Amelia Reed, may your life together be long, prosperous, and filled with love. To the Reeds, the crowd echoed, glasses raised high. As the evening wore on, Xavier led Amelia away from the festivities to a quiet spot beneath an old oak tree. From his pocket, he produced a small box. One more thing, he said, opening it to reveal a simple gold ring set with a small, perfect diamond. I've been carrying this since I left 3 years ago, bought it with the first money I saved as a promise to myself that I'd come back for you. Amelia gasped as he slid the ring onto her finger above her wedding band. It's beautiful, Xavier. Not half as beautiful as you, he replied, bringing her hand to his lips. Mrs. Reed, the name sent a thrill through Amelia. I like the sound of that. Good, Xavier chuckled, because you'll be hearing it for the next 50 years or so. The journey to Wyoming Territory began a week later. George Foster elected to stay behind, his health much improved but not equal to the rigors of starting over in a new place. The ranch would remain his, with trusted hands to run it and a share of the mine's profits to keep it solvent. I'll come visit when you're settled, he promised as he embraced his daughter. And when those grandchildren start arriving, Amelia blushed but didn't contradict him. We'll hold you to that promise, Father. The wagon was packed with everything the newlyweds would need to start their life together: tools, household goods, clothing, and a few cherished mementos. Xavier helped Amelia up onto the seat, then turned to shake George's hand one last time. Thank you, he said simply. For trusting me with your greatest treasure. George nodded, emotion making speech difficult. Make her happy, Xavier, that's all I ask. I intend to, sir, every day of our lives. With final farewells called out, Xavier took his place beside Amelia and picked up the reins. The wagon lurched forward, beginning the long journey to Wyoming and their future. As Sweet Creek disappeared behind them, Amelia leaned her head on Xavier's shoulder. Are you sure about this? She asked. Leaving everything behind, Xavier's arm tightened around her. The only thing I ever needed was you, Amelia. Everything else is just extra. The days on the trail were long but filled with a sense of adventure and possibility. Each night, as they made camp beneath the vast canopy of stars, Xavier and Amelia learned more about each other, filling in the gaps of the 3 years they'd been apart. I never believed I'd see you again, Amelia admitted one night as they lay side by side, gazing up at the night sky. After a year of no letters, I started to give up hope. Xavier propped himself up on one elbow, looking down at her in the firelight. I never did, not for a single day. His finger traced the line of her cheek. Even when I thought you might have found someone else, I couldn't stop loving you. Amelia reached up, drawing him down for a kiss that spoke of all the years of longing, all the nights of dreaming of this very moment. I'm glad you didn't, she whispered against his lips. 2 weeks into their journey, they crossed into Wyoming Territory. The landscape changed, becoming more rugged, with sweeping plains giving way to distant mountains that seemed to touch the very sky. "Almost there," Xavier announced as they crested a hill. "See that valley there with the creek running through it? That's our land, our home." Amelia's breath caught at the beauty of it. The valley was green with spring grass, the creek sparkling in the sunshine. A stand of cottonwoods marked its course, providing shade and shelter. And there, nestled against a gentle slope, stood a house small but solid, with a porch across the front and smoke rising from the chimney. "Someone's there," Amelia said, suddenly wary. Xavier laughed. "That would be Tom Jenkins, neighbor from the next spread over. I wrote to him when we left Montana, asked him to get the place ready for us." As they approached, a man emerged from the house, waving in welcome. Tom Jenkins was a weathered rancher in his 50s with a quick smile and forthright manner. "About time you got here, Reed," he called. "Been keeping the coffee hot for 3 days." Xavier jumped down from the wagon and helped Amelia down, his hands lingering at her waist. "Tom, this is my wife, Amelia. Amelia, Tom Jenkins, the best neighbor a man could ask for." Tom swept off his hat, revealing a bald head that gleamed in the sun. "Mrs. Reed, it's a pleasure. My Betty's been beside herself waiting to meet you. She's over at our place getting dinner ready for you folks. Figured you wouldn't want to cook after all that traveling." Amelia smiled warmly. "That's incredibly kind of you both." "Neighbors look out for each other out here," Tom said simply. "Now come on inside and see your new home before we head over to my place. Betty's fixed it up nice, added some feminine touches she thought you might appreciate." The house was indeed small, just 3 rooms, a main living area with a kitchen, a bedroom, and a small study. But it was clean and well built, with large windows that let in plenty of light. Betty Jenkins had added curtains, a colorful quilt on the bed, and fresh wildflowers in a jar on the table. "It's perfect," Amelia breathed, turning in a circle to take it all in. "Absolutely perfect." Xavier watched her, his heart full. This was what he had worked for, saved for, dreamed of Amelia in their home, beginning their life together. "We can add on as needed," he said. "More rooms when?" "Well, when we need them." Amelia caught his meaning and blushed prettily. "I'd like that," she said softly. Tom cleared his throat, reminding them of his presence. "Well, now, I'll just go hitch up my wagon and let you two get settled. Come over for dinner when you're ready. No rush." After he'd gone, Xavier took Amelia in his arms. "Welcome home, Mrs. Reed," he murmured, bending to kiss her. Was it worth the wait? Amelia's arms wound around his neck. "Every minute," she assured him. "Every single minute." The years that followed brought all the joy and challenge that Xavier had promised. The ranch prospered under their joint care, with Xavier's knowledge of cattle and Amelia's keen eye for horses creating a breeding program that soon gained recognition throughout the territory. Their family grew as well. First came William, named for Xavier's father, a sturdy boy with his mother's blue eyes and his father's determined chin. 2 years later, Elizabeth joined them, named for Amelia's mother, with a mop of dark curls and a laugh that could brighten the darkest day. George Foster made good on his promise to visit, arriving for extended stays each summer. His health continued to improve in the clean mountain air, and he became an indispensable part of their family circle, doting on his grandchildren and offering wisdom drawn from a lifetime of ranching. On the 5th anniversary of their wedding, Xavier surprised Amelia with the completion of a project he'd been working on secretly for months, in addition to their house that doubled its size. Adding a proper dining room, 2 more bedrooms, and a special space just for her. A small library with floor-to-ceiling shelves and a comfortable window seat overlooking the valley. "Xavier, it's wonderful," she exclaimed, running her hands along the smooth wood of the shelves. "But how did you manage it without my knowing?" Xavier grinned, pleased by her reaction. "Tom helped. So did his boys. We worked while you were visiting your father in Montana last month." He took her hand, leading her to the window seat. "Sit with me." As they settled onto the cushioned seat, Xavier reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, leather-bound book. "One more surprise," he said, handing it to her. Amelia opened it curiously, then gasped. Inside were all the letters she had written to him during their separation, carefully preserved, along with his replies, the letters her father had kept from her. They were arranged chronologically, creating a narrative of their love story. I thought we should keep them together, Xavier explained. So we never forget what it took to find our way to each other. Tears welled in Amelia's eyes as she leaned against him. As if I could ever forget, she whispered. You waiting for me was the greatest gift anyone has ever given me, Xavier. Xavier's arm encircled her shoulders, drawing her closer. And you coming with me was mine. He kissed her temples softly. No more waiting, remember, just living. Just living, Amelia agreed, turning her face up to his. Together. Outside, the Wyoming sun cast long, golden shadows across their land. In the distance, cattle grazed peacefully, horses ran in the pasture, and their children's laughter rang out as they played under the watchful eye of their grandfather. Inside, in the quiet of their new library, Xavier and Amelia Reed held each other close, two hearts that had found their way home despite all odds. The waiting was over. Their life, their real life, had begun the moment they decided to face it together. And neither would trade a single day of it for all the gold in Montana territory. As twilight settled over the valley they called home, Amelia looked up at her husband, the love of her life, and smiled. I'm glad you waited for me, she said simply. Xavier's eyes, still as blue and clear as the day they'd met, crinkled at the corners as he smiled back. Waiting for you, he said, echoing words spoken years ago, is all I know. And as their lips met in a kiss as sweet and promising as their first, they both knew it had been worth every moment.